Weiss shivered as she felt the cool air creep under her skirt and against her bare legs. "This is it?" she asked their fondest teammate. "This is definitely the place." "It is," Blake agreed, crouched down behind a wall. "Thank you for coming. I really appreciate this." "Better us than Jaune," Yang whispered from nearby. "Honestly, I'm kinda surprised he agreed to this at all, but I suppose it makes sense when you consider the docs. Father-daughter bonding indeed." She chuckled. "Someone had to do something. The White Fang are a threat that can't be ignored." "I couldn't agree more," Weiss said. It was why she agreed after all, though there'd been a part of her that had decided to go along with it just to prevent her partner having to. The dolt would have pushed himself while sick again, and reaped all the rewards of such. "You were right to tell us, Blake, and to bring us here instead of him." "I'm not sure he will agree." Jaune wouldn't. Weiss knew that, but it was for the stubborn fool's well-being, so she would force him to swallow it. He couldn't run around driving himself to exhaustion like he was doing. He needed to take a break. And so what if they used his stupid booty call as an excuse to sneak out and do this? If it meant he didn't need to do it later, then all the better. She just wanted him to slow down a little. "It's gone quiet," Yang reported. "The guards have all gone inside." Weiss snorted at their lack of discipline. Atlas soldiers, even the SDC security forces, would never be so foolish as to enter a building without leaving someone to secure the perimeter. It just went to show how unruly these terrorists truly were. Blake led them across the road into the factory's main compound. The wall was broken down in several places, and it looked like it had collapsed on the western side, the place where they had seen several lorries ship goods into the building. As they approached, voices piped up from within the factory itself. Her back pressed against the cold brick as she listened as best she could. "It's some kind of speech," Weiss whispered. "No doubt some rousing rally for brainwashed martyrs." Blake spared her an irritated look but thought better of commenting. "Do we go in?" Yang asked. "You said this was just to scout it out, right?" "We need to see what they're doing," Weiss hissed, to a nod from Blake. "We haven't found out anything yet. Try to find a window where we can listen in from." The speech inside continued as they searched, the occasional crackle of rock or stone that crunched underfoot causing them all to wince. No one heard them, however. They were all too busy inside. Yang found a window by a door a few moments later and waved them over. Blake held a finger to her lips and shushed them as they looked through. It was an abandoned and mostly dark factory, as Weiss had known it would be. Her attention was drawn immediately to the stage, the only part of it still lit up and where most of the people were congregated. The distance was too far, and the light too low, to make out much in the way of detail. But the sheer number of people was evident. "There's so many," she thought worriedly, only to shake her head and ignore it. Quality over quantity. They had to believe in that. It was the person on the stage who had her growling, however. "Roman Torchwick," Blake hissed. "So they're still working together." Weiss's eyes looked a little further as shock ran through her. "Paladins? That's the weaponry that was stolen from Atlas. How did they get it into Vale?" "I don't know," Yang whispered, "but this smells like trouble." "You're not wrong there, missy." Shock ran through Weiss as she spun and drew her weapon in one swift motion, only for it to be jerked cruelly out of her hands. Her back slammed into the wall a second later. Blake joined her, a hand buried in their collars. Weiss glared futilely at the man who stood before them. She tried to lash out with her foot, but he took it with a raised eyebrow and no sign of pain. He only had 2 arms, however, and Yang was still free. If she could just... "Uncle Crow?" The hand was gone from Weiss's clothes and on Yang's lips a second later. "Shut up! Shush, shush!" The grizzled man whispered as Weiss fell to the floor and leaned against the wall. "Not so loud, Firebrand! Care to tell me what 3 little students are doing out here?" Firebrand? Students? So he knew who they were. They weren't about to be captured? You know this vagabond, Yang? That's not... Okay, yeah, he is. He's my Uncle Crow. Yang said happily when the hand kept her silent was pulled away. We're here investigating the White Fang. Yeah, nah. The man's eyes narrowed. You are not getting involved with this. Excuse me? Weiss whispered. Who do you think? Deaf! The chorus came from within the building and cut them off immediately. The man's eyes narrowed as he released the Weiss's teammates and stepped towards the window they had been looking through. Weiss took the chance to rush over and collect her weapon, breathing a little easier once it was back within her grasp. She never felt so utterly hopeless before. He'd been so fast. Shit, Silver. The man jumped away from the window and backed away. He held an arm out and herded them all with him as he drew the weapon on his back. It clicked and twisted, the blade flipping over 90 degrees as he aimed it at a gas canister attached to the wall. Weiss's eyes widened. Wait, what are you do? It seemed to happen in slow motion. His gun went off and a loud pinging noise sounded almost straight after, as a hole appeared in the metal container. Sparks flew and air whistled, before the metal bulged and buckled. The explosion that shook the floor around them blasted hot air back into their faces, and Weiss fell to the floor coughing. When she looked up, he had already leapt inside. He's your uncle. Yep. Somehow I'm not even surprised. She stood up and wiped her skirt down. Already she could hear screams and shouts coming from inside, followed by gunshots and the clang of steel on steel. She gripped her weapon tighter. Do we? If we can stop them here, Blake said, it would mean stopping Torchwick too. It would. It would also mean Torchwick's thefts on her family would come to a halt. That would be something to tell Winter and her father for sure. Also, it would finally mean Jaune could rest without having to do any of this. Weiss charged into the smoke and ash, her team behind her. The interior of the factory was pure pandemonium, and in a way that gave them the cover they needed to take in the scene. Yang's uncle cut a terrifying swath through his foes, his course set on the raised stage in the middle of the room. White Fang rushed in to stop him, while other faunists in masks ran past them and out to safety. It didn't even stop to challenge the three huntresses. Weiss's eyes took in the carnage, but also the main stage where Roman Torchwick was shouting something to his subordinates. There was a strange girl with vivid shades of pink in her hair, not to mention other White Fang soldiers in full uniform. But there was also a hooded figure he pointed to, who seemed to be running away with his hand atop his head. Yang, go help your uncle. She snapped. Blake, come with me. We'll try to cut off their escape. Got it. Yang grinned and charged away, while Blake nodded and rushed with Weiss towards where the others were fleeing to. Yang would be best suited to slot in with her uncle, likely knowing how he fought. A few weeks back, Weiss might have suggested she and Blake challenge Torchwick, but after hearing what he was capable of, it was best to leave that to this huntsman. Blake was far by the fastest and reached the door before the masked faunist could. He seemed to freeze in place when he saw them as his mouth fell open in pure horror. He looked behind him, and then back towards them, drawing a small knife from within his uniform. Weiss crossed her arms with a smirk and walked carefully towards him. Surrender, she said. You're outmatched and facing a huntress. If you comply, I'm sure your sentence will be lenient. Barely visible behind his mask, Blue eyes widened as he stepped backwards and looked for an alternate escape route. Blake's heels clicked as she stepped up to stand beside her teammate, her weapon drawn. There were no words from the quiet girl. Why suppose she had wasted them all the last time and now felt only anger? Give up, she repeated. He bolted to the left. Watch the door! Weiss yelled as she dashed after him. Blake nodded and fell back while a white glyph appeared beneath the heiress's boots. There was no noticeable sensation of its effect taking hold, but the wind that blasted against her face as she moved heralded her increased speed. Her eyes narrowed as she blocked it out with practiced ease, lunging forward and aiming for the man's right shoulder. He turned at the last second and lashed out with his dagger. It caught the tip of her weapon and diverted it just a fraction. With all the force behind it, it was enough to make it skim past his arm. The hilt and Weiss's body still crashed into him, the impact enough to send them both some distance. She ignored the pain and pushed him back. Training kicked in as she leapt back to put space between them, before darting in to flick a strike across his brow. The Faunus didn't flinch or sway back as most would. He pushed forward instead, deflecting the side of her rapier over the back of his palm. Meant for thrusting and dust application, the edge wasn't sharp enough to cut through skin and he travelled it down to her. Indignation flashed through her as she disengaged and forced him back with a quick flourish. Did he truly believe she would let him close with a dagger? She was no fool. In fencing, the distance between two opponents was paramount, and that was more so here because of the advantage she held. Her weapon extended as she kept it leveled between the two of them and waited for his attack. Another shout came from behind. Torchwick's unmistakable voice barked out answers as he climbed atop one of the stolen machines. Weiss smirked as she watched the Faunus divot and glanced back to her. "That's right," she said. "You don't have much time before your employer is captured. If you intend to try and get by me, you'd best start now." As if he could. She was a huntress and a proud member of Team Beacon. He must have considered her distracted, for he darted to the side and spun, one arm flashing as he launched a blade towards her face. The metal glinted as it flew through the sky. Weiss snorted as she flicked her weapon for her face and deflected it. The cocky retort on the tip of her tongue died when she lowered her weapon in time to see him run away once more. "Hey!" she shouted. "We're not done here!" He glanced back and quickened his pace as she cut the distance between them. When it was clear he couldn't escape with speed, he leapt over a conveyor belt and waved between some machinery. Weiss growled as she slid beneath it all, ice coating the ground and helping to carry her the full distance. She pushed down at the end and launched herself up, landing a little clumsily, but still managing to keep up as he led her deeper into the factory. Behind them, they heard a raft of rapid gunfire and the sound of Torchwick's voice over some automated system. One of the paladins was moving now and began to fire towards the ground. Panic shot through her for a moment, and she nearly gave up the chase entirely, only to sign relief when the huge robot staggered back. A cloaked figure crouched on its arm. Yang will be fine. She has a real huntsman helping her out. She had her own task, and her weapon chambers began to spin as she concentrated. A wall of solid ice appeared before the fleeing terrorist. It was so sudden that he slammed into it, but he recovered and pushed himself back before she could collapse it atop him. That still placed him directly in her path, and it was only his quick reflexes that prevented her driving the tip of her rapier into his leg. "You're quick," she panted, "but it's time to end this. Let me go." The voice sounded familiar. It was a little gravelly and deep. There was some hidden quality there, something that jogged her memory. She dismissed it quickly and leveled her weapon once more. Whatever it was, whoever it was, it could be dealt with once the danger was over and he was safely in handcuffs. He sighed at her clear desire to fight, and she watched him reach over to grab a chain from the conveyor line beside him. He glanced down at it before spinning it in one hand. Weiss's analytic mind considered it, not to mention the potential weaknesses. It was a thug's choice of weapon at best, but a powerful nonetheless. That said, it didn't offer much in the way of defense against a foe with superior speed. A small smirk crept across her face as she lunged forward. That cheer died an ugly death as he caught the chain with his other hand, pulling at it taut and using it almost like a short staff as he knocked her blade aside. He twisted with the momentum and drove an elbow into the back of her head. She felt pain flare through her skull but forced herself to roll forward and escape his follow-up attack. To her surprise, there was none. He watched her warily but made no move to finish her while she was hurt. He's good, she realized with a frown. Good enough to survive a single pass from her, which obviously meant he was stronger than the most generic White Fang soldiers who didn't even have basic training. Still, That begged the question. Why was he running away at all? He must have important information. She realized. If Torchwick was prepared to stay, as were his companions, but this man felt he had to run, that was a sure sign that he had something to hide. Something the hunters could use against the Fang, perhaps. She had to stop him. She lunged forward towards his face, only to reverse her strike and catch him across the cheek with the hilt of her weapon when he dodged. He fell back with a grunt, but kept hold of her hand and pulled her across him. He turned and angled her towards a box filled with chains before letting go. Weiss winced as she landed atop them, but was able to roll with the impact and surge back to her feet. She kicked one out towards him as he tried to flee, but he managed to knock it aside. That still gave her the opening necessary to slash down towards his head once more. Her weapon slammed against the chain, held taut above his head, but this time she had planned for it. He gasped as one foot caught him on the side of his knee, and although she'd been looking for a distraction only, he seemed to buckle in pain. She wasn't so foolish as to look a gift horse in the mouth. "Ha!" she yelled and flicked her blade towards his ribs. Crimson splattered across the floor. The man gasped and one hand came up to touch his stomach as he backed away, all the while Weiss stood with wide eyes as blood dripped from the tip of her weapon. He didn't have aura. That knowledge hit her with the weight of a sledgehammer. All the while she'd been attacking and cutting towards his head and shoulders as she aimed to disable him, only now to be faced with the reality of their fight. She could see a thin trail of blood seep from between the fingers of the hand he held across his stomach. This was no aura-aided combat that would come to an end with him drained but unconscious. This fight had an added weight to it, something that made her feel clammy and afraid. She didn't know if she could kill someone. He took full advantage of her distraction to lunge forward and grab her sword, which still hovered before her in shock. Her hand tightened about the hilt, but he used that to draw her in and push the weapon, and her arm, deep into the chains. He pulled and kicked at one and she gasped as her arm was pinned beneath the weight of them. A delicate leg kicked out to ward him away, but she was trapped and helpless. "Weiss!" Blake yelled from some distance away, and she knew her teammate would come. "You won't get away with this," she whispered to the White Fang before her. He panted and held his wound as he watched her. She pulled on her arm once more and almost got free, but for a single tight chain wrapped about her elbow. It gave her enough freedom to lunge forward and take her weapon with her offhand. Clumsily, desperately, she waved it before her to ward off his finishing blow. It never came. He backed away once, spared a glance for her arm, and fled. The chains clinked as she slumped against them and let out a relieved sigh. What a fool she was. She should have been prepared for such a thing, and it had almost cost her. Blake's terrified scream cut through her thoughts. "Weiss!" A shadow fell over her a second later as she looked up towards a robotic foot that was poised to stomp on top of her. She didn't have time to think or scream. She felt the rush of air as it came down, the chain links that bit into her arm as she tried to pull away, and then a strange surge of terror as she realized not only did she have time for screaming after all, but that she was just doing that. It ended as she clenched her eyes shut and hoped her end would be swift. She didn't see what prevented it. She heard a great sound like a car crash. She felt an arm settle beneath her as she cracked her eyes open, in time to see a silvery blade shear through the chains that pinned her. The huntsman wrapped her in his arms a second later and leapt aside, as a huge paladin crashed to the floor behind them. Weiss was not ashamed to admit she shook like a leaf when he put her down. Her mouth was dry, her legs weak, and her hand shook so hard she dropped her weapon. Yang and Blake were upon her a second later, and she took more comfort than she thought she would have in their embrace. "Thank you," she gasped to Yang's uncle. "That wasn't me," he whispered as he looked her over. Weiss's eyes widened as she craned her neck to follow his gaze. At the back of the factory, slumped over with one hand against the wall, the White Fang member she had wounded stood. He watched them with a face covered by his mask. his features hidden by a hood. But his hand she could see a control lever, and swinging back and forth over where she had been, a great metal hook, dinted on one side. It didn't take her long to realize what had happened. "Why?" she whispered. Of course he didn't hear her. He was over 50 meters away, and that moment he realized she was safe. He slammed his shoulders against the fire door and escaped into the night. He took his answers with him. That's what I'm trying to find out. The huntsman who held her side. As for him, I guess we'll call him Silver. Silver. Weiss's muscles were still a quivering mess of jelly by the time they arrived back at Beacon. At least on that front, Yang's uncle had been able to requisition them a ride, though the fact he apparently answered to the headmaster raised the question of whether they would all get detention for this. The look on Miss Goodwich's face when she appeared from the bullhead that came to pick them up certainly suggested so. Awkward didn't even begin to describe the silence on the way back home. All in all, not to mention with a quick debriefing they'd received, it took them over an hour to return. He escaped. Yang repeated for the 100th time. I can't believe Torchwick escaped. We had him right there. He was trapped in the paladin we knocked over. Technically, we didn't do anything, Blake pointed out. If anything, Weiss was the one involved in taking it down. Not that she could bring herself to feel proud about that, noticeably because she'd only been involved as a damsel in distress. That was not a role a Sneeze should be in. At least we know why he's remained free for so long, she said. That companion of his is likely aided in all his escapes. The knowledge of her might make it easier for others to catch him in the future. Yang gave her a dirty look. Not that Weiss could argue with it. Yeah, the sentiment was a weak one at best. She was furious he'd managed to get away too. All that work, all that fighting, now the detentions, and he just poofed out of existence. She had the urge to utter some very unsnee-like words. They might have made even Yang blush. Not to mention the informant. You're still suspicious about that? Yang asked Blake. What's so hard to believe? Isn't it exactly the same as what you did? It is. And I'm not suspicious. I'm just... I can't remember anyone else who shared my opinion. I'm wondering if I knew them, or could have helped. Weiss was curious too, though she kept silent on that matter. It wasn't a big surprise Blake didn't know the guy. From what she understood, if you were having misgivings within the White Fang, you didn't share that sentiment with others. Either way, the man had saved her life even after she tried to kill him. She didn't know what to think about that. Luckily, the arrival at their dorm room kept her from having to. The door clicked open as they entered, only to freeze as a dog's low growl sounded. Shh, shh. Yang whispered. It's us, boy. It's alright, shh. The sound stopped immediately, but the dog didn't greet them as he customarily did. That was perhaps good for Blake, whose response to the slobbering greetings was akin to that the people in a horror movie had to a killer. But it was still a little off. That was, until they spied the form slumped beneath the dog, asleep in bed. Jaune? Yang whispered. Wasn't he off sleeping with someone? He said so. Blake winced. I guess this means he knows we snuck off. Worried you'll get in trouble? Maybe he'll spank you. Weiss barely heard either of them. She stepped forward to look down on him, absent-mindedly patting the corgi which refused to move from atop his form. So, he hadn't actually gone off to sleep with some random girl. She wasn't sure why she felt so relieved. He twitched in his sleep and seemed to coil a little tighter around himself. It looked like he was clutching at his stomach. As she watched, he whimpered lightly and tightened. Was he having a nightmare? Before she could decide what to do, whether that was to wake him or not, Zui pushed his body against the man's chest. Jaune seemed to relax a moment later as his breathing evened out. Good boy, Weiss whispered before she turned to the others. Shh, he needs his rest, you dolts. Don't wake him up. And she needed to clean herself up. She swore she could still smell the blood.